Hold on. Okay, so hello and welcome to Digging In. And I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of this speaker series. And Diggin' In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And you can join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through November for all of our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. Additionally, all presentations will be uploaded to the YouTube channels of the Peabody Institute and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. During the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function on the side of your Zoom screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will give our speaker time to answer as many of your questions as they can, with the understanding that we might not make it to all of them. And today we are very excited to have Dr. Alix Martin joining us. Dr. Martin is the archaeologist at Strawberry Banke Museum. She directs annual archaeological field schools and is responsible for maintaining the museum's collections of over 1 million archaeological artifacts. Dr. Martin is also a faculty fellow in the anthropology department at the University of New Hampshire. She has a BA in anthropology from Mount Holyoke College and an MA and PhD in anthropology and historical archaeology from the College of William and Mary. Dr. Martin started her archaeological career as a volunteer for scrap in her hometown of Merrimack, New Hampshire, when she was just 12 years old. She has worked throughout New England as a student, field technician, lab manager, and field school director. Her work has also taken her to the Caribbean, the American Southwest, Africa Town in Alabama, and Colonial Williamsburg. Welcome, Dr. Martin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to see a bunch of people. So Lindsay had actually invited me to give a talk in person this spring that got canceled, in that first wave of cancellations of basically our whole lives in mid-March. So I was really excited to have an opportunity to present anyway, albeit from my home here in Dover. I have my dog Luna with me, but I'll be able to share some information about Strawberry Banke archaeology with you. So let me get my screen shared here. There we go. Does that look right?
Yeah.
Title screen. Okay. So I'm going to give you a tiny brief introduction to Strawberry Banke Museum for those of you who haven't been before, and then talk about 3 of the major archaeological sites that we've been working on recently and share a couple of interesting finds from them, and then leave plenty of time for questions about other research or volunteer or future opportunities when we can get back to normal. So Strawberry Banke is a living history museum in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We have a approximately 10-acre campus with about 40 historic buildings, most of which are on their original foundations. Unlike other living history museums that present a specific year in history, like at Colonial Williamsburg, it's always 1775. Strawberry Banke presents history from its indigenous residents who've lived in the area since time immemorial, through the 1950s when the last residents of Puddle Dock were in residence. Move on here. Video's a little slow over Zoom. So like I was saying, the history of Puddle Dock, the neighborhood that Strawberry Banke is built around, begins in time immemorial. The Abenaki people of New Hampshire, we know from both oral histories and archaeological evidence at the museum, used the area a lot like people do today to come in the warm months, take advantage of the summer for hunting and fishing, and then they would return inland to more permanent settlements in the colder winter months. The first European settlers to arrive in the area came in 1623, naming the neighborhood Strawberry Banke, and the permanent settlement began in 1630. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Puddle Dock neighborhood and Strawberry Banke, later Portsmouth, around it grew as an international commercial port and became the shipbuilding, naval, and fishing city that Portsmouth really still is today. By 1904, that open green space you saw right at the beginning of the video, which had formerly been a tidal inlet, was filled in, and Puddle Dock in particular became more of an immigrant neighborhood, home to Irish and later Jewish immigrants at the turn of the century. Especially with the Jewish immigrants, the scrapyard industry came to town, and by the mid-20th century, the neighborhood was slated for urban renewal. The plan was to tear down historic buildings, but fortunately a group of local preservationists were able to purchase the buildings instead and save them and create Strawberry Banke Incorporated. So we've been doing archaeology at Strawberry Banke basically since its beginning. The first digs there were in the early 1960s. And you can see in that black and white photo, one of the early excavations of one of the wharfs on Puddle Dock that was excavated by Robbins, who's also famous for uncovering the foundation of Thoreau's cabin on Walden Pond. He did things a little differently than we do today, but we still have a lot of important archaeological evidence from his investigations. But we've continued to do archaeology over the last 50 plus years to help interpret and inform the houses and the landscape that visitors see, to inform reconstruction of buildings like the privy in the lower left-hand corner is a total reconstruction at the Ryder Wood House. For new construction, like these bathrooms at the Jefferson House, which were added on to a historic structure, and through the process of rehabilitation, where by needing to repair some of our historic homes, we have rebuilt foundations, or even just adding electrical or water lines. Sometimes construction might affect archaeological resources, so we dig before we let a little bulldozer get in there around the foundation. But one of the most important reasons, I think, that we do archaeology at Strawberry Banke is for education. Of course, the education of the visitors and of the general public. I mean, you know, we're participating in an educational experience right now, but also hands-on education for field school students. So typically in a non-pandemic summer, we have an archaeological field school on site at a different house, depending on the needs of the construction team or the interpretation plan. And we invite students from around the country to come learn excavation methodology. And this is my favorite time of year because the digs are always open to visitors to come and discuss what's being found, why we're digging. People are always surprised to learn that there's still work to be done at the museum. So it's the time of year that archaeology gets the most visibility. We also, in the past few years, introduced a lab school by request, really. Students always ask, what are you gonna do when we leave and you go back inside? And so I decided to start training them also in the process of the lab work, the cataloging, the research, and what goes into preparing a report, but also a furnishing plan for our historic houses. And to ensure that there's a public component for that as well, since we don't have the capability to let visitors wander in and out of the lab, the lab school culminates in a public open house where students present their findings to invited and regular day visitors. So I want to talk about a few houses on the museum grounds where we've worked recently. The first is the Walsh house in the center of campus. It was built in 1803 and used for most of its history as a multifamily home. We first did excavations there, just exploratory phase one kind of research in 2007. And in 2015, trenched around most of the building in advance of a full foundation reconstruction. So the main family who lived at this home for over 60 or 55 years, whatever that is, half a century, was the Welch family. And there they are listed across a few censuses. They're a pretty large family who had immigrated from Ireland in the early 1850s, possibly due to the potato famine. And we can see by looking at these documentary records, including city directories, that when they first moved into the home, they were sharing it with 2 other families, but in the 1870s were able to purchase the house for themselves and use it as a single family home, and ultimately host boarders. As you can see on the 1900 census, they're hosting more recent immigrants from Ireland. So we got really into researching the Welches, and I discovered some of the descendants, some of whom live in Portsmouth and others of whom live all over the country. But Mary Agnes Welch is one of the kids of Michael and Bridget. So she grew up in the Yetton Walsh house, married Thomas Collins in Portsmouth. They had a bunch of kids, and some of their grandkids are still around and provided us with these photos. So before Yetton Walsh house had not been used as a space for the public to visit, but the research we did surrounding the archaeological work and then some of the artifacts themselves have inspired us to interpret the home to the period when the Welch family lived there and talk more about their experience. So just a couple of the interesting artifacts we found that date to the Welch period history include this fragment of a child's mug, a little creamware mug, with the face of Major General Ulysses S. Grant on it. And apparently this was part of a trend in the late 1800s of decorating children's plates with Civil War generals. You can see the embossed alphabet on the plate, so you can learn history and your ABCs while you're enjoying your children's meal. Also, a couple years ago, one of the field school students spent some time reconstructing some of the transfer wares from Yetton Walsh. So here's an example of one of the plates from the Welch kitchen that we hope to find a similar example of to furnish the house with. We also found some evidence that again relates back to the documentary evidence. So here's a little glass bottle from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was a treatment for sick children that contained morphine and alcohol. It's popular in the late 19th century and, surprisingly enough, outlawed by the FDA, I think just after the turn of the century. But we know that Kate Welch, one of the children of Michael and Bridget Welch, around this time died as an infant of cholera. So it's possible that the presence of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup in the archaeological assemblage was related to her illness. Okay, I'm going to keep moving around the campus and move on over to the Penn House. This house was built in the mid-18th century, but then moved to Strawberry Banke in 1862. So here it is, just the corner of it depicted in its original location, like a block and a half away on Court and Pleasant Street. And we know it was moved on July 19th, 1862, precisely because of this newspaper clipping. Someone got injured in its move, but also handily enough, we found a 1862 Indian head penny in the Builder's Trench along Washington Street. So this home we are planning to interpret to its mid-20th century period, when it, as well as a couple other homes along Washington Street where it sits today, were home to African-American families. So Jerry Palmer grew up in the house in the 1930s, and later her uncle moved into the house as an adult, but here he is pictured at Portsmouth Junior High School in 1928. So we're still working on looking through the artifacts from this house, but I just wanted to show you a couple photos from the excavation. So we were interested in this addition that was put on the back of the house. What was moved in 1862 is what is to the right of my sign board on the foundation there. And then a little salt box addition was added later on. And we were exploring the foundation line to see how much repair it needed to help inform our restoration carpenter's plan. We also found this really interesting base of cobblestones. It's about 60 centimeters deep, so too deep to have been part of the road. I think that it was part of some like terraforming or land shaping, because this is right on the edge of what was that tidal inlet. And we continued to dig a little bit to the east of our 2016 excavations in 2017, because there's going to have to be some moving around of buildings. So we wanted to explore what was next to this building we call the Red Shed before work began on it, and found a continuation of that cobblestone feature. So this is helpful to us. We left the cobblestone feature mostly intact. We just dug underneath it in a unit in each excavation block to see what was there, and found a lot of layers of tidal sediment as well as late 17th century artifacts indicating that these were put here after that. But we want to leave it mostly intact. So this is really helpful information to pass along to our restoration carpenter and the construction team who will be making the alterations to these buildings in advance of our future interpretation of the home to the Richardson's family's time. And then finally, I want to talk about Sherbourne House, which is back on the east side of campus. This is the oldest house on the museum grounds. It was built right on the edge of the tidal inlet in 1695. And continued to be occupied over time. Here it is as it looked when the museum acquired it in the 1960s. It had become a 5-family apartment building. You can maybe just see the little 5 electrical meters, and it was covered in this very popular mid-century brick patterned asphalt siding. So it was one of the earliest buildings to be restored by the museum so that it could be opened to the public in the 1960s. So no archaeology went into its restoration at the time. However, in the 1980s, the museum asked the archaeological staff to begin investigating the backyard to help understand how the lot was used at the time the Sherbourne family lived there in the early 18th century, and then to reconstruct the landscape as it would have looked. So today, when you visit, you see approximately 1730-ish design, including these raised beds, the fence line, the position of the beds, the layout, even many of the plants that are in the raised beds are all based on the archaeological evidence, both features that indicated where post holes or planks had been set to plant the raised beds, and then paleoethnobotanical analysis helped inform what types of plants were grown there. And it's largely a kitchen and medicinal garden, although there's some flowering plants, as you can see. It wasn't just for an ornamental experience. And people are sometimes surprised to find that raised beds, so similar to what we are still using today, were common, but throughout the early 18th century, this is what a lot of people were using for their kitchen gardens. So some other historic research went into the Sherbourne garden as well. We recently, last summer, returned to Sherbourne because we're planning to re-restore this house. We have some updates that we'd like to make, some fixes to make to the way things were done in the 1960s, and then just some ideas about how we could better utilize the space. Right now it's an architectural exhibit, but we'd like to have a more furnished space and an exhibit that talks more broadly about the experience of the first period in colonial New England. So we targeted this area on the back corner of the house because we were thinking we might need to add a second form of egress, maybe a staircase, maybe some HVAC. So it was in response to conversations with the carpentry team. We uncovered a foundation line of an addition that was put on the building in the 1770s. as well as a bunch of interesting artifacts that still need to be washed, most of them. We've been stuck out of the lab for a long time. But last summer, the field school students had the opportunity to return to some of the artifacts that had already been processed from those 1980s excavations. And so I want to share some of the things that we're looking at that could potentially go into the exhibit that we're hoping to open around the time of Portsmouth's quadricentennial in 2023. So they were really interested in the people who lived at the Sherbourne House. And in addition to the Sherbourne family, the Sherbourne House was home to 2 enslaved Africans who are not named in the historic record, but are listed. So at first we were looking at some of the more utilitarian early 18th century buttons, but during last summer's excavation, we also found this cowrie shell, which is often an indication of an enslaved African on site. And interestingly, right next door to the Sherbourne family lived the Marshall family, who owned 3 enslaved Africans, who we have a little more documentary evidence about and know they came from the West Indies. But this cowrie shell makes me wonder if the enslaved Africans at Sherbourne came directly from Africa. So we're continuing to do research so that we could say a little bit more about the 2 enslaved Africans at Sherbourne. But we also have some personal items or small finds that can tell us more about the Sherbourne family themselves. So here are a couple personal items possibly owned by Mary Sherbourne, a thimble and a chain that researchers think is part of a chatelaine, or like a woman's utility belt, essentially. And then this swirly metal stick here is a cosmetic spoon that could have been used for scooping cosmetics or scooping earwax. I love that. And here's a couple paste gems from Joseph Sherbourne's time and a fragment of a wig curler, which are status markers that are kind of unique to the Sherbourne family compared to a lot of the other contemporaries in the neighborhood. So just a little taste of Sherbourne artifacts. And I wanted to end by mentioning what we're working on right now since we're working from home. So as you can see, we've done a lot of research over the past few years, and there's still a lot of report research and article writing to do. We have a remote intern this summer who I know is on the call. She is working from her home in Newton, Massachusetts on research and data entry. And then next week, instead of an in-person field school this summer, we are doing a virtual field school, which will be a 1-week program with some video elements and some activities to help students learn some, they're gonna do a little ArcGIS, a little crowdsourcing data work, the types of things that we archaeologists are having to shift to these days. So we'll see how that goes. I'll keep you posted. So I'll wrap up there and leave us some time here for questions.
I have to unmute myself. Well, thank you. That was really good. So we have one question, and that is, did Portsmouth and the close vicinity largely survive King Philip's War during 1675? And was there any other conflict where Portsmouth was attacked?
Yeah, so Portsmouth wasn't really involved in King Philip's War. Of course, they knew about it, but the battles didn't make their way to Portsmouth. It was already a really urban center doing a lot of shipping. So I think I get the sense from looking through the historic records of that time that they were busy focusing on that. The only story we have of any conflict with the local Abenaki people is nearby. It might have even been in Newcastle, not Portsmouth. I'd have to check. But apparently some Abenaki men went in retaliation for an attack on them and targeted some merchant's wife. But it was a really like personal conflict, not part of a larger tribal colonial conflict.
Okay. Also, in terms, Could the cobblestones have been used to combat mud?
Yes, I think exactly right. I didn't have the map in the slideshow, but even the road that the early settlers used along the tidal inlet, they called Puddle Lane, which suggests to me it wasn't a great road. And we see over time different maps of the neighborhood show the shape of the tidal inlet morphing a little bit. And so, yeah, I think they used this layer and a half of cobblestones to help stabilize the edge of the tidal inlet so that they could, you know, who knows, access their ships better, build a wharf on top of it, ultimately build buildings on top of it.
We have another question about the buttons. How do you fasten a button that only has one hole, like one of the ones you showed?
Yeah. Should I go back to it?
Sure.
Hang on. So one of these you can see actually still has a little metal shank in it. So on this side, there's a flattened metal disc, and then there would have been a shaft that went through the hole in the button and had a loop on the other side. So that's the best way to fasten it. You could do the same thing though with a knotted piece of thread, have the big knot on one side, go through the cloth and knot it on the other side.
Okay. Let's see. For what services might the enslaved people have been brought to Portsmouth to do?
So in the homes at the museum where we know there were enslaved Africans, there were 6 of them. I think all of them were also running businesses. So the Sherbourne family were there as merchants. They had a shop added onto their house. They had a wharf, so they're importing and exporting. And so they could have required assistance with that. At the Marshall pottery site next door, where I said we know the enslaved Africans came from the West Indies, they were a pottery production site. So they were making and shipping redware ceramics up and down the coast. And then 2 other houses that I can think of were taverns, and so they enslaved Africans to assist and work in the tavern. So it doesn't seem, at least at Strawberry Banke, that many of the residents had just an enslaved person to help around the house.
Okay. Have you, this is just my personal question. Have you guys been working with the African Burial Society in Portsmouth? Because they've been really big at looking at the sort of enslaved community that was there, to see how it might inform, you know, how you guys are looking at these, you know, while unnamed individuals, very important individuals.
Yeah, definitely. We have a close relationship with, so the African Burying Ground in Portsmouth is part of the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail. And they have 4 sites on the Black Heritage Trail that are on the grounds of Strawberry Banke. And so that, for people who aren't familiar with the Portsmouth African Burying Ground, there were 9 individuals that were encountered and disinterred during a city project. And so while the remains were disinterred, we actually stored them at the Sherbourne House because it was a nearby location where they could be safely kept. And we're also planning to work closely with the Black Heritage Trail folks in preparation for telling the story of the African American community of the mid-20th century when we do so at Penn.
Very good. Well, thank you. I will do one last question as I cough. Are you guys open?
Yeah, good question. We are now open starting on July 1st. We have been hosting outdoor only small group guided tours. And we were all asked to pitch in. So I'm leading tours on Mondays and Wednesdays, which inescapably have a little archaeological flavor. So if anybody wants to come to town and sign up for a guided tour, you're welcome to do so. You know, if things continue to be okay here in New Hampshire, our plan is to be open through the end of October, which is our normal historic house season.
Well, great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Martin, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great presentation. And join us in 2 weeks, everyone, when we have Dr. Christina Douglas, who will be talking about archaeology in communities. She is also an alum of Phillips Academy. And thank you again just to everyone for your time and coming today. So,
yes, nice to see everybody.